Hi everyone, Kim Turner here. Welcome back to the podcast for episode number 4. And before we begin, I'd like to thank you so very much for the overwhelming response, for everyone following, sharing, and liking the podcast and downloading it from Apple or Spotify or wherever you listen to your podcast. Today, we're going to talk about 911 first responder stress. Now, if you know me, you know that this subject is near and dear to my heart. And our special guest is Dr. Michelle Lilly, who will no doubt provide tremendous insight to dispatchers as well as agencies, and particularly the pathway forward with NG 911. Before we get started with that, I'm starting something new that I'm excited to do. Last week's episode was about recruitment and retention. What better way to be a partner with agencies than to have a moment of recruitment? So today's featured agency is Orange County Fire Authority. And I'd like to play their recruitment video, or one of them. And I actually know this guy, and he's a pretty fantastic dispatcher and a wonderful human being.
Fire emergency. I've always worked in customer service or customer relations to some extent, and kind of wanted more, and I think doing this is the ultimate form, I think, of customer service. My name is Emilio Duval. I've been a dispatcher for about 17 years. What's the apartment number? Okay, Staten. And what's your phone number? What I like is that no 2 days are the same. Every day is a different day. There's always something new happening, something different, so it keeps it interesting. This is a patient of ours. There's a kid who had a seizure at school and went actually into cardiac arrest as a result. So, the quick activation of the 911 system, somebody there doing CPR right away, and the help over the phone made a full recovery. And then they made these mugs for the crew that helped. And this is him, and they gave me one. That was the call taker. So it's great, and I use it every day. Free time, I do a lot of traveling, just spend time with my family, my kids, cook and learn languages. I'm on my 3rd, so that's it. Departamento de Bomberos, ¿cuál es la dirección de su emergencia? 1, 2, 3, 4, Sur Main, en Santa Ana, ¿correcto? The lack of closure that we have, I think, throughout every single day you have this intense moment with a person on the phone, you're helping them, and then in a critical time, and then you're the first one to help them, and then you never know what happens after that. And my 3rd is Italian. Parlo abbastanza come per farmi capire, ma non abbastanza come per farmi fare questo lavoro. And that means speak Italian enough to have a conversation, but not enough to do this job, basically. So that's it.
And some of the things that Emilio spoke to about the lack of closure, that very much Michelle will have a conversation about that, because it really lends to dispatcher stress. It lends to the things we could do in terms of resilience and understanding that while our job may have its moments of difficulty, the fact that he saved someone's life and is included in that, and every day has a reminder with that mug, that's our why. That's his why. He's there for a reason. He's a lifesaver. He's a first responder. So thank you, Emilio. And for those that are interested in dispatching for fire, absolutely check out Orange County Fire Authority, and that's OCFA if you are in Southern California. I'd like to kind of segue a little bit, and let's watch this news story that talks about dispatcher stress. This is out of Kern County, which is Southern California, heading up through Bakersfield on your way to Central Valley.
3ABC News at 5 starts now.
Good evening. Tonight we are highlighting those in public safety who are rarely seen but are still there during some of your darkest hours. 23 ABC's Tori Cooper joins us in studio with the stories from local dispatchers detailing how they cope with the stressful aftermath of those life and death calls. Tori?
Jessica, this week law enforcement agencies all across the country are spending time showing gratitude to those who work in the telecommunications departments as part of their annual appreciation week. But what we don't always talk about is the post-traumatic stress dispatchers and call takers are dealing with day in and day out. So tonight we are sharing details on how our heroes in headsets are coping with some of the most difficult moments.
They are your behind-the-scenes heroes.
Like where we take calls of, rollovers with fires and people trapped in the vehicles, and that's a little bit hard to, shake off.
Who always sound calm when you call for emergency help.
You're hearing people screaming and they're hysterical because they're seeing it.
But people like California Highway Patrol dispatcher Cassandra Vidal and KCSO dispatcher Tammy Olinger are the ones who are listening to it.
After all the emergency's done is when I have that kind of, sometimes have a meltdown a little bit, whether it's just a moment to step outside the room, maybe shed a few tears. There's been a couple times I've walked down the hall and sobbed.
Although Olinger and Vidal both work for different law enforcement agencies in Kern County, they both say they are dealing with the same type of everyday stress behind the scenes.
Okay, just keep a safe distance. What type of vehicle is it?
One study conducted by the Journal of Traumatic Stress says the call most commonly identified as the one that is the worst for dispatchers to cope with is the unexpected injury or death of a child.
We've had every type of call you can think of. Usually the ones with children always are a little bit harder to digest.
Along with suicidal callers.
I was speaking to a woman who was in the Walker Basin area, and the deputy's response time was 30 minutes. And I stayed on the phone with her during that entire time.
And shootings involving their coworkers.
I've had an officer-involved shooting. That was pretty intense.
Both departments say they provide tools for them to cope through the post-traumatic stress after they hang up the phone.
There's the Employee Assistance Program, which is readily available to all employees. We have the Crisis Intervention Stress Management Team, and then we have peer support.
Both women agree the CISM team, or Critical Incident Management Unit, along with support from coworkers, plays an integral role in their mental stability at work.
A lot of times it's just that short talk with somebody who empathizes or has, maybe prior experience.
They also say the debriefing process after a traumatic call is extremely helpful.
It's closure. It's very tough to start an incident and you don't know how it unfolded. You don't know how it ended or what details, we're on this end, we're inside, we're safe. We don't know what happened on the other end. So it's good to kind of piece the story together.
But they say they push through it for more than just the appreciation others may express this week.
But it's knowing that we did a good job and that we were there when that person needed us.
So I think it's a fascinating theme, right? The idea of closure and what that looks like for you. So speaking directly to my 911 audience, I'm just going to ask you an open-ended question. Do you require closure? Do you seek out the outcome? Do you look at CAD for the disposition? Do you reach out to the deputy, the officer, or the firefighter to ask questions to find out why? If you do, it's perfectly normal. If you don't, it's perfectly normal as well. All of us operate differently, and all of us have different things that may or may not stress us out, that may or may not cause concern. And the other thing that I want to make perfectly clear, because there's mention of PTSD, is that that's a clinical diagnosis. It's not something I can diagnose you with, or a friend or a coworker, right? That's an actual clinical diagnosis. Just to kind of put that out there for information. What are some other things that stress you out? Is it overtime? Is it maybe that I have to work overtime and I don't have control over the overtime? Is it mandatory overtime versus voluntary overtime? Is it shift work? How often do you rotate? Does it create conflict for your home life or personal life? Is it difficult adjusting physiologically with your sleep pattern and eat pattern? Work-life balance. Are you able to actually manage successfully your life away from work? Or does work become a predominant driving force and you no longer find joy at home? I think that's something that is very individual, but be honest with yourself, right? Like, how can I actually create more life in that work-life balance. Stressful calls. We've obviously just watched this news report that talks about that. How are you managing those stressful calls? If you're in a busy center, you may not have downtime between calls. Do you have an action plan? Do you have a meditation plan? Do you do short-term meditation or long-term meditation? Do you do yoga? Do you walk? Do you breathe? You have to have a plan. And no plan is wrong if it works for you, as long as it's a healthy plan. And when I say healthy, I mean we aren't going home and drinking 1, 2, or 3 or 4 cocktails. That occasional glass of wine, there's nothing wrong with that. But if you're drinking too much. Are you sleeping too much? Do you need to talk to someone? There's nothing wrong with talking with someone. And I'll just end it on this. We all work for public safety agencies. And if we had an officer that asked for assistance in the field, we wouldn't judge it. If we have a backup dispatcher, we expect them to help us, and we wouldn't judge it. If we have a firefighter who asks for additional equipment to attack a problem and a fire problem, we wouldn't judge it. So why do we judge ourselves if we need help? It's counterintuitive to everything we do. Just want you to think about that for a moment. And if you need help, there are a lot of resources available to you, whether it's your local EAP, whether it's Dr. Michelle Lilly, whose information will be available in this chat, whether it's a priest, whether it's a minister, whether it's a best friend, whether it's a peer support team member. There's lots of help out there. You're not alone. That I will tell you. You are not alone if you're a 911 first responder. I always end by saying thank you. Thank you for what you do. I look forward to continuing this conversation with this podcast, adding additional guests, and I'm sending an open invitation. If you are hiring and you have a dispatch recruitment video, and I'll double down, if you want to come on the podcast and, advertise for your agency and get some qualified people to come out and to work for you, you know where to find me, Kim@thekimturner.com. I look forward to hearing from you. I look forward to having you on the podcast and showing off your agency. Until then, stay safe and stay well. So Michelle, welcome to the podcast. I'm excited to have you. This is episode 4, and we're talking about dispatcher stress, and who better to talk about it than arguably the international subject matter expert when it comes to 911 stress and outcomes. So I just found out that you are a Michigan Wolverine, right? So congratulations on your national championship.
Thank you.
It is very painful for me to say because I'm a USC Trojan. However, you have to give credit where credit is due. So congratulations on that epic win. It was a long time coming, some battles, and you persevered. So yeah. I definitely have to give you your props. I also would like for you to I know that people in this audience will know who you are, but there may be some who don't. If you could just take a moment to introduce yourself, your background, and sort of your focus in your research.
Yeah. So I'm a professor at Northern Illinois University. I've been there since 2009. I'm in the clinical psychology department where we predominantly, train the next generation of trauma-focused clinicians. And in that endeavor is where I actually started doing some research with 911 telecommunicators. So it was about a year into my new position as a professor and a non-traditional undergrad who's working in my lab. She and I started talking about cops, and we were, kind of being like, oh, cops, blah, blah, blah. And then she said, oh, I'm married to a cop. And I said, oh, well, when I was in grad school, I used to do research with retired cops. I'd love to get back into the first responder thing. And she said nothing. And then a couple of days later, she came up and she said, hey, I didn't know if I told you, but I was a dispatcher for 7 years. And then she was telling me all about the job, and I was really floored as she was telling me about the demands. I, like everybody else, really truly had no clue what it was like. And she still had some connections in the field, and we leveraged some of those connections to collect some preliminary data on mental health and 911. And we published that in 2012. And there was a very sizable response to it, much more than I ever thought would be possible. We were kind of almost immediately being invited to national conferences, and there was a big news release. And truly, I thought this might be a project or two that I do. And the 911 industry never let me leave after that. So, so I've never left, and they haven't allowed me to. So I've continued to publish data on mental and physical health, also looking at things like peer support, looking at kind of childhood maltreatment history, more recently looking at moral injury. And in addition to working with 911 telecommunicators, I also work with police, fire, EMS. So I'm a licensed clinical psychologist in the state of Illinois. So in addition to my role at NIU, I do evidence-based treatments for PTSD, depression, anxiety, and first responders and their families. Kim and I have also worked together a bit, doing a little work with agencies that might need some buoying, some help to try to figure out what might be ailing them, and then sometimes going in and having critical conversations. And then I do training across the country on topics such as PTSD, resilience, risk for suicide, stress management, peer support, and more recently, a kind of half-day training on preparing for NG911, a course on moral injury. So going across the country, training on lots of different things.
I appreciate you giving really that global overview of your work. You touched on something sort of in the middle and the end that I want to kind of pick your brain about. We recently had a conversation with Karima Holmes, and she's with Carbine now. And part of that conversation was NG911 and sort of the expectations and some of the maybe false narratives or some of the ways we can apply the technologies to create better efficiencies. From your perspective, the psychological perspective and the new training that you're doing, like what's your take on this?
Yeah, I think that there are going to be some really hard calls, right? There's going to be some calls that are particularly gruesome that no person probably would want to bear visual witness to, and I think that that's scary, and I think that is kind of rightfully makes people a little afraid of this. And so I can understand some of that. What I would also say is there are some really horrifying calls that people handle completely auditorily, and those are really hard too. So from the theoretical and empirical background on PTSD, I wrote a white paper a couple of years ago outlining the ways in which I really could argue that there could be net positive psychological benefit from NG911. I think it's going to better be able to help people save lives. People go into this work wanting to save lives, and when they do not, I think sometimes it has a potential to result in moral injury and other adverse psychological health outcomes. We also know from research that just hearing things is actually harder on our brains than seeing and hearing things. And so when we don't see things, our brain has a tendency to fill in details, and some of those details may be far more gruesome than is actually true. And then also from a PTSD perspective, knowing more about the call, knowing more about call outcome would theoretically create a more kind of complete and coherent narrative. And we know that our brains prefer complete and coherent narratives because it helps us process them and make meaning of them and then kind of timestamp and catalog it as a memory. When we don't know outcomes, when we don't know information, our brain might be more prone to kind of slipping it into our consciousness when we least want it, right? So you're driving in a car, you're in a shower, and your brain hasn't made sense of something that happens, and all of a sudden it's going, now's a perfect time for you to start remembering this thing that happened and try to figure it out. And so, and those kind of intrusive memories can be very distressing for people and prolong a lot of suffering.
And with that explanation, if you were building a program at an agency that is going to integrate this technology, if you could only do one thing, what would be the one thing you could do for the staff that would be handling like the imagery?
Yeah, that's like a golden question, Kim, and I don't know that I have a great answer to that. I of course am going to say training, right? So I'm an educator, scholar. We know that when people have the information, when they have the skill set, when they're adequately prepared, and they're not entering into it with a fear-based reaction, they're going to perform better. and they're going to be less likely, quite honestly, probably be traumatized by it. So we know that when we enter into things with anxiety, it makes us more likely to attribute that thing as threatening, right? As fearful, as problematic. So if we can provide kind of solid training, maybe from the start, kind of splitting the duties between someone who's handling the call and one person who's just looking at the video, until people feel more comfortable. I think that would go a very long way in a more successful adaptation of NG911 into center.
I really love your answer. I had a conversation just yesterday with a group of CTOs, and part of that conversation was the job that you train is not the job you learned because of the rapid adoption of technologies, right?
Yeah.
And part of that conversation was we do the job the same way that when I started in this industry in 1989, in 2024, the processes are the same. Perhaps the conversation should be a bifurcation of duties, that we're separating out the duties so not one person is responsible for so much in such a timely reaction. I really love the idea of training, and my mind is going a million miles an hour about, Michelle, create best practices for like the United States because you're the person who could do it, right? But it's just a really fascinating conversation. What are some other things, maybe not specifically related to NG911, that may be upcoming trends that you see in the industry?
It's a really great question too. Obviously, any conference you go to now, you hear those letters AI. And so I don't think we can get away from it, even in this industry or any other industry. Literally every minute of the day, I feel like I'm hearing about AI and the advances in AI and how it can kind of transform things, right? And I don't know that I'm different than a lot of people, that there's a little bit of fear in me about when I hear AI, and I think, ooh, but then you realize that some of it's not so scary. But when you talk about this bifurcation of duties, and then I don't know if Karima got into this, but I think we're at this place right now where we're just adding technology onto technology onto technology, and there's like this technological bloat where we're requiring 911 telecommunicators to handle this system and this system and this system while also doing these things, and trying to get these things to play nicely together. But I can't imagine a world where technologically we don't move to something that is much more streamlined, where all these things are able to kind of exist in one kind of platform or one space that could actually significantly reduce the overall stress level in multitasking. So right now, some of the stuff I think is increasing multitasking, but I think technologically we're probably had to do a place where there's going to be more streamlining, and I think that's going to make the job maybe harder sometimes, but maybe quite a bit easier. So I think that's certainly coming right down the road.
So I'm just going to say this on behalf of every dispatcher in America. If AI can create one password for every single system that you have to log into, it has done its job.
Yes.
That's clearly an API issue, not an AI issue, but I will share with you, AI is everywhere. So just last week, I went through a drive-through to grab something to drink, and it was AI that took the order. And I actually, when I got to the window, I said, was that AI? And they were like, oh yeah, we've been testing it out for a couple months. So it's a computer.
Did it get your order right? Is the most important question.
Right? It repeats it back. And the reason why I immediately am like, that's not a person. It sounds it sounds like the voice, like the default voice for mapping. Like, if you have an iPhone, you could change the voice and the accent, but like the default female voice, it sounded like that. Okay. And I was like, oh, this is not a person. I'm not talking to a person. And there was no affect. Right. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't like the 16-year-old that wasn't paying attention to you. I guess that's what I would say. So I was like, oh yeah, this isn't normal. Like, that's what's happening here.
Although I will miss, like, if that ends up happening, I will miss the cheeriness of the people who work at Chick-fil-A.
Right. Interestingly, I don't think Chick-fil-A would ever go to AI
Yeah.
because that's
No,
their
maybe
brand,
not.
is their friendliness, right?
Yeah.
That's why you pay more to go to Chick-fil-A because of the
Yeah.
customer service, and the computer really can't do that for you,
No.
right? Yeah, so that's interesting. Is there anything else? Before we part, please tell me, do you have any upcoming projects? Are you going to be speaking at a conference? And at the end, I'm going to ask for a not shameless plug about your consulting business and where you could be contacted for the agencies that are listening.
Yeah. So I will actually, so it's Friday today. In about 48 hours, I will be hopping a plane to come out to California.
Yay!
So I'll be at yay. So I will be at Cal Nina next week, which is very exciting. I would love to come out there. But I'll be presenting as part of a panel for a large scale research project that we did with 911 call takers and dispatchers across the state of California, looking at staffing and retention. So that's really exciting.
Was
Then
that with
I
Cal? Was
think,
that with Cal OES?
yep, with Cal OES, yep.
All right.
Mm-hmm.
Shout
Yep.
out to all my California folks at Cal OES. They're an amazing team there. Amazing team.
I love them. Yes, they are. I enjoy working with them so very, very much. Yeah. Then I'm off to do some trainings, more through my business. The next big conference I will be going to is actually ENA, European Emergency Number Association, over in Spain. So I'll be headed to Valencia the third week in April. Be talking about kind of stress and wellness in 911, 112 over there, which is interesting. It's so interesting going to Europe because I feel like with some of the technology, they're maybe slightly ahead,
Oh yeah.
or maybe
Mhm.
less fearful. But with some of the health and wellness stuff, maybe they're not quite as far ahead, depending on the country and organization and agency. So that's really fun. And then I'll be going to National Nina this summer in June. Uh, that's off the top of my head, but I'm traveling all over the place too, just to do, again, trainings, working with organizations. So those are the big things coming up right now. I just today, and I meant to do it before I was logged onto this, but I ran out of time. I have a graduate student who is very interested in the concept of moral injury. So moral
Cool.
injury is when people experience psychological distress at feeling as though they're bear witness to, fail to prevent, or perpetrate kind of acts that run counter to their deeply held beliefs. This is a construct that really came out of the armed services. So when people are in war, they act differently than they might at home, and sometimes they come home with that psychological distress. There's some overlap between moral injury and PTSD, but there's not perfect overlap. It's not quite a disorder in the DSM yet. So there is much, much, much to discover about moral injury. And one of my graduate students is, I think, kind of quickly becoming a subject matter expert on the topic, and is launching a thesis project where very short, like a 7-minute survey for 911, cops, fire, and EMS, just to start to continue to, or really to continue to learn more and more about moral injury. So if you're interested, just email me at mlilly1@niu.edu. But I'll also be putting it up on LinkedIn. So if you go on to LinkedIn and you find me, I'll have a link for it there too. If you can distribute that widely, it is super helpful. We can't do this research, right, unless people are really willing to invest their time and resources. So we are just about to launch that literally today. So that's very exciting. Shameless plug, or not so shameless,
It's not shameless.
unashamed
That's right.
plug. So about 3-4 years ago, I kind of went out, and I've been a licensed clinical psychologist for a long time. But in pursuing tenure at NIU, I just did not have the time to do much clinical work. So I started my own business about 4 or 5, well, it was 2018, so almost 6 years ago, to
Wow.
do
It's been that
clinical
long.
work. I know, right?
Wow.
But then COVID like shut it all down for a little bit. So it's like very weird. Like in the middle of all of it, I was like sitting and twiddling my thumbs and wishing my kids would go back to school. So like I said, I do treatment for first responders and their families. I work through retainer with a lot of agencies, particularly in Illinois. So we all know that a lot of organizations, agencies are dissatisfied with their EAP, their employee assistance programs. A lot of people don't use their employee assistance programs. So these retainer services are, in my opinion, a really excellent way to set up confidential services and relationships of trust with culturally competent therapists. So do that. And then in terms of kind of more of the consulting space, I use my background in research methodology and group intervention. So when agencies are kind of struggling and people are maybe not getting along, or they're not quite sure what's happening, or they think that, maybe there's some supervision issues, coming in and doing a really kind of broad scale organizational assessment can be very helpful. So I developed a measure called the Problematic Workplace Cultures Questionnaire that I've kind of normed and validated in 911 telecommunicators, which looks at different kind of problematic workplace behaviors that might happen really at any group, but in first responders. So it looks at, are people kind of excluding each other? Are they kind of bullying? Is it all the same people doing all the same work? Is there diffusion of responsibility? Is there supervision issues, management issues, leadership issues? Is there more pernicious stuff like harassment? And then I tie that into individual level functioning in health. So I also measure things like depression, anxiety, stress, to look at kind of the overall psychological functioning in agencies. And then sometimes from there also work with agencies to course correct as I can. And then, like I said, do trainings all the time, all over the place. The next one is in a couple of weeks. I'll be going to Mark in Kansas City and doing some trainings on moral injury. Just got back from California, or not California. That's where I'm going. Just got back from Texas a couple of weeks ago and did a full day course called Protect 911. So love to get out there and train. It is really probably the most personally and professionally rewarding work that I do. Because sometimes, you'd publish this research and nobody reads it. I mean, the 911 research, I think people actually read, but, historically, some of that empirical research, people don't read it, right? So it's been really fun to actually just get out there in the room and talk to people about their lived experience and the ways that they're struggling, and ways that you can protect and bolster your mental health to increase longevity in these jobs.
So what I hear is that if you're a dispatcher listening to this, a supervisor, a manager, a director, how can I deal with a potentially toxic culture? We've heard the adage of eating our young and on all of those things. I think that you need to email Michelle, and we'll make sure that we'll have your email available so agencies can reach out to you, because the work that you do is truly invaluable, Michelle. And I don't know how often people tell you thank you, but thank you very much for what you do, and having been in this industry long enough to see the evolution of serious, legitimate research, and really giving us insight to the outcomes and the opportunity to really be better. So thank you so much for what you do. I really appreciate you taking the time to have this conversation with me, and I look forward to seeing you in just a couple of days.
I know, this is going to be amazing. Well, Kim, when I saw your first podcast come up, I thought, I should go on Kim's podcast. And I think I emailed you almost right away, and I was like, nice podcast, Kim. And I was like, I better be invited.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because I adore you. So people might not know this, but I've known Kim for probably almost a decade now. We met for the first time in person at Calnina.
That's right.
And we've published some papers together and have done some trainings together. And,
I was going to invite you in person at Calnina.
What's that?
I was going to invite you in person at Calnina. We just did it before, so it works out great.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's been a pleasure. And, Kim, I don't know how many times or how often people say thank you to you.
Oh, thank you.
But you are probably the leading champion for all things 911, and it's been so exciting to see just all the amazing, incredible work that you do, and it's been a pleasure knowing you, my friend.
Thank you, Michelle. I look forward to many more projects together. Travel safely, and I'll see you in a couple of days.
Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.